Hi guys, today I'll be painting up a Daemonettes of Slaanesh. As usual, I start off with a base coat of Chaos Black from a spray can. This is then followed by a layer of gold flesh through an airbrush. I use a thin coat and I basically do the entire model. With purple shadow, again through an airbrush, I then apply a coat to the claws and to the spikes on the tail. The scales they have on the legs I paint in later with a brush. Once that's dry, I'll wash the entire model with Druchii Violet. With a regular paintbrush, I'm now going to apply a base highlight on all the skin parts. I make sure I leave some of the Druchii Violet visible and some of the airbrush layers as well. As for the claws and the spikes on the tail and the scales on the legs, it's the same thing. I now paint them in with purple shadow. Again, I leave some of the previous shading visible. Using cold flesh and pale flesh in a 3:1 ratio, I apply a next highlight to the skin tone. I make sure the previous layer stays a little bit visible, so that there's a nice transition between the two colors. In a 4:1 mixture, purple shadow 4 parts and 1 part squid pink, I now highlight the claws and the spikes on the tail, as well as the scales on the legs. I added 1 part dead white to the skin tone mixture, which now consists of 3 parts gold flesh, 1 part pale flesh and 1 part dead white, to apply a last highlight to the skin. I followed the same steps as the previous layers on the skin, but this time leaving again leaving a little bit visible of the previous layers. For the claws, the same thing goes. I add 1 part dead white to the mixture, of 4 parts purple shadow and 1 part squid pink, and I apply a final edge highlight to those parts. Make sure you leave the shading you achieved earlier visible. I also made sure I painted in an upward direction so that the highlight is towards the light. Using khaki, I then painted the necklace, the rope for the necklace or the band, no matter what it is. This is then followed by a wash of airbrush Earthshade. Using metallic black, I paint in the metallic parts. In this case, it's only the chainmail. This is then followed by a wash of Nuln Oil. Using a mixture of 2 parts black and 3 parts Indian Shadow, I now paint the armor pieces and the cloth. This is just blocking it in, making sure it has full coverage on every part I want it on. By adding 3 parts Indian Shadow to the mixture, I apply a first basic highlight. I only leave the previous layer visible in the deepest recesses on this one. Using Beastie Brown, I now block in all the horns and nails that aren't painted yet. Using old copper, I'm going to block in all the golden parts. I used a different model for this because the other model I had didn't have that much gold on it, and on this model it's much clearer to see. Using khaki again, I highlight the ropes and the band of the necklace. Using airbrush Earthshade, I wash all the nails and the bone parts. I also wash the gold. This is to achieve the shades for later on. If I go outside of the gold a little bit, it's not that big of a deal. Using silver, I then gently dry brush the metallic parts. Using pure Indian Shadow, I now apply a next highlight to the cloth and the armor. I make sure I leave a little bit of the previous layer visible, once again, in the recesses of the model. And I work outwards for the highlight effect. Using leather brown, I now highlight the bone parts and the nails. I do this with thin lines from the inside to the towards the outside of the model. With a mixture of 1 part leather brown and 2 parts bone white, I apply a next highlight to the bone and nails. Again, I use thin lines, so you get a nice striped effect. As a last highlight to the bone parts, I apply a coat of pure bone white. I'll make sure all previous layers are a little bit visible, so there's a nice transition on them. Using a mixture of 6 parts Indian shadow and 1 part dead white, I now go on and apply a rough edge highlight to the ropes and the armor pieces. I stay on the outsides of the armor and on the upper parts of the armor and ropes. By adding 1 part dead white, I'm now going to apply a final highlight to the armor and the ropes. Again, I stay on the more visible parts, the more upper parts, and the outside of the parts as well. Using Dwarven Gold, I now am going to highlight the golden parts. This isn't, you don't need to be really precise in this, it's not that big of a deal if you accidentally hit a deeper part a little bit. You don't want it to be fully colored, but a little bit doesn't hurt the model. Using silver, I now give the golden parts an edge highlight on the most outer and upper parts. I also paint in the little studs the model has on the armor pieces. This is then followed by a wash of Seraphim Sepia. I did wash the studs on the armor piece though, I want them to look silver. Using dead white, I paint in the eyes. I do this in a horizontal line. This is then followed by a vertical line of black, just black, in the middle of the eyes. This is then followed by a glaze of Lamenter's yellow. And I wasn't that fast if it went outside of the eye a little bit, so that if that happens, the eye appears a bit glowing. Using German grey, I now block in the hairs. This is then followed by a rough highlight of cold grey. It doesn't need to be exactly precise, and it doesn't really matter if you hit a little bit of the recesses on the model, especially on the upside of the hairs. Now I apply a coat of non-oil on the hairs, and be careful around the skin. You don't want it to spill over on the skin a lot. Once that's dry, a highlight of cold grey is then applied to the hairs, and I just paint these on. I do try to be as precise as possible now. In a 1:3 ratio mixture, I mix in cold grey 1 part and 3 parts stonewall grey for a final highlight to the hairs. And that finishes up these models. I hope you liked this tutorial. I decided to go for a bit simpler scheme, especially on the skin, because I want to make an army out of these and I don't want them to take up too much time. So please like, share and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time, guys. Thanks for watching.